Thank you all so much for being here. I am Holly Daniels, and I serve as a research associate at the Community College Research Center, which leads the Accelerating Recovery in Community Colleges, or ARC network. Today, we are going to cover our recent analysis of federal pandemic relief funding at community colleges. So we'll begin our time together today by reviewing the ARC network and the federal government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic as it relates to education funding. We will then provide some background information on our study before jumping into the findings. At the end, we will hold some time for questions and answers. So feel free to add questions to the chat as we present. We will be monitoring the chat as we go. You can add more substantive questions to the chat throughout the presentation as well, and we can address any questions we didn't get to in the chat at the end during the Q&A portion. The team members leading this work were myself and my CCRC colleagues, Tia Monahan and Megan Anderson. I am so grateful for their collaboration on this project, and I know that they are equally as excited as I am to present our findings to you all today. So with that, I will pass it off to Megan to get us started.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Holly. We are part of one of 6 research teams studying pandemic recovery as the Accelerating Recovery in Community Colleges, or ARC network. The ARC network was founded to provide timely, accurate, and impactful research to support community colleges, emergency recovery, and beyond. The project teams within the network span across the country and study a large gamut of topics, including student basic needs services in California, coaching and student supports in Tennessee, workforce training scholarship incentives in Virginia, and online learning practices in Los Angeles. We're grateful to work with the teams from the California Policy Lab, the Tennessee Board of Regents, WestEd, Harvard Center for Education Policy Research, and Wheelhouse at UC Davis. The network is led by 3 partner organizations, a team at the Community College Research Center, and teams at Wheelhouse, the Center for Community College Leadership and Research, and the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center. This network and our work has been generously supported by the Institute for Education Sciences, or IES. Our study examines the federal response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, or CARES Act, which quickly provided an unprecedented amount of recovery funds to multiple sectors, but a particularly unprecedented amount of funds for community colleges. The CARES Act and subsequent legislation injected about $4.6 trillion into the economy and over $75 billion into higher education institutions through the Higher Education Emergency Relief, or HERE Fund. $25 billion of this went to community colleges. So these funds were intended to serve 2 main purposes. First, to ensure that institutions of higher education could continue serving students in the midst of unprecedented disruptions. And second, to provide emergency aid to students facing financial challenges during the COVID-19 pandemic. Funds were designated in 3 categories: institutional aid, student aid, and other aid. Though colleges were given some limited guidance on how to spend these funds, they were strongly encouraged to use professional judgment and consider adjustments as needed, case by case. So institutional aid was intended to both cover institutional costs related to the COVID-19 pandemic and the transition to online learning, as well as bolster the funds allocated for student aid. The total amount of institutional aid awarded was $13.3 billion. Student aid was intended to provide emergency aid directly to students facing financial challenges during the COVID-19 pandemic, and these funds totaled $9.7 billion. And then finally, what we're calling other aid was intended as supplemental funding to meet any unmet needs from the institutional and student categories. These funds were much smaller in their award size and were awarded based on the characteristics of an institution and its service population, such as historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, tribally controlled colleges and universities, or TCCUs, and minority serving institutions, or MSIs. The total amount awarded in this category of funds was $1.8 billion. And now I'll turn it back over to Holly to take a closer look at our study.
Thanks, Megan. Now we'll take a look at our data and the colleges that were included in our sample for this analysis. So we know that community colleges serve a largely low-income and minoritized population, that they are underfunded relative to four-year public colleges, and that community college students are more likely to be older adults and part-time attendees with jobs. In the first year of the pandemic, community colleges experienced declining enrollment overall, and especially among Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous students. Additionally, community college students commonly experienced job loss, housing insecurity, and difficulty in paying for household expenses throughout the pandemic. So many community college students who were facing substantial disadvantages before the pandemic were left without the resources to overcome the financial shock that the pandemic caused. These struggles were recognized by the federal government, and our analysis revealed that community colleges received nearly $25 billion in HERE funding. A primary motivator of this study was the unprecedented amount of money that was received by community colleges, and we were curious the degree to which institutions were able to spend this $25 billion. The data presented in this report were sourced from the U.S. Department of Education Stabilization Fund Transparency Portal, which provides the public with accounts of how ESF funds were awarded and spent. Colleges were responsible for periodically reporting data on HERE spending directly to the U.S. Department of Education, and each institution or district that received funding has a page in the portal that shows how much funding was awarded and how much of that they spent. We identify community colleges as they were listed in the ESF transparency portal, some of which were reported at the district level. And with that, our total sample includes 976 community colleges or districts. We define community colleges as public institutions primarily granting sub-baccalaureate credentials, such as associate degrees and certificates. While some colleges in our sample offer bachelor's degrees, they are primarily associate degree granting institutions and identify as community colleges. In some instances, community college branch campuses of universities were not reported individually in the transparency portal, in which case we were unable to separate the community college data from the university data. So in those instances, the colleges are not reflected in our data set. We also sourced variables from IPEDS, the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System, on institutional and student characteristics at community colleges in the 2020-2021 school year as the pandemic began. Variables from IPEDS include enrollment size, enrollment intensity, Pell status, race, ethnicity, and gender. We use these variables to supplement the Tableau dashboard that accompanies our report that we will preview a little bit later, and to provide context to our main analysis of funding and spending. We already know that the 976 community colleges in our sample were awarded nearly $25 billion. The average total of HERE funding awarded to an institution was $25.3 million, but there was a wide range. The smallest award was just over $306,000 at a college in Alabama that enrolled fewer than 400 students in fall of 2020, while the largest award was over $357 million at a college in Florida that enrolled about 46,000 students in fall of 2020. On average, colleges spent about 95% of their total funds, with 400 colleges having spent all of their funds by the spending deadline of June 30th, 2023. I do want to note that this June 30th, 2023 deadline, colleges could ask for an extension to this deadline if they still had some aid to spend. Depending on the aid that they had remaining to spend, the extension could be 6 months or 12 months. However, because this was the original spending deadline, that is the cut point at which we started collecting all of our data. So the transparency portal provides dates that the data were last updated. And so once we saw that all colleges were listed as June 30th being the most recent data, we pulled everything and stopped our collection at that point. We classified the 400 colleges that spent all of their funds as total spenders in our analysis. And these findings were exciting because this was the first time that colleges received such large sums of money to spend on a fairly quick timeline with little guidance. Regarding guidance, the CARES Act was very clear that student aid was to go directly to students for expenses related to COVID-19. Colleges were also allowed, and it seems encouraged or urged, to use some of their institutional aid for additional emergency financial aid grants to students. And in fact, the Secretary of Education noted that colleges could use some or all of the funds that were earmarked for institutional aid for additional emergency financial aid grants to students. As Megan mentioned, institutional aid totaled almost $13.3 billion, 94% of which was spent by the June 2023 deadline. The average college received over $13.6 million in institutional aid, and over 515 colleges spent all of their institutional funds. There was a good deal of flexibility in what these funds could go to, and as I mentioned earlier, some of these funds could actually go to additional student aid. The student aid category totaled $9.7 billion, was again almost entirely spent by the colleges. On average, each community college received $9.9 million in student aid, and over 800 colleges spent all of their student aid funds. This was a very exciting finding again, and particularly because student aid was unique in that it went directly to students and was either dispersed to students and deposited directly into their student accounts or mailed via check. There were a number of methods that colleges could use to get this money to students, but it was very clear that it needed to get to students and get to them quickly at the onset of the pandemic. So we were actually really encouraged to see that virtually all of this $9.7 billion went to students. Other awards were much smaller than the institutional or student awards, and were given to colleges in part based on institutional characteristics to support greater equity. As Megan mentioned earlier, other aid totaled almost $1.8 billion across 781 community colleges. The average other award was about $2.2 million per institution that received them. And as you can see here, colleges spent about 79% of these other funds. Now I will pass it to Tia to talk more about how these funds were allocated and to dive a little bit deeper into our spending patterns.
Thank you, Holly. So as Holly mentioned, and as you can see on this map, colleges received very different award amounts. So this is a screen grab from our interactive Tableau dashboard that Holly is going to do a demonstration of later on. And we definitely encourage you to go check out, look at institutions as well as states that are of interest to you. So the way to interpret this is the darker colors here show more funds being awarded in those states. So for example, we see that California received the most HERE funds by far, which makes sense. They have millions of community college students, and they have over 100 community colleges, while Nevada, for example, received a much lower amount. So these award differences came directly from the different elements used in the allocation formula to award funds to colleges. Allocations to colleges were basically just based on enrollment, specifically the student and institutional portions. At the beginning of these emergency fund under CARES, it was a relatively simple formula. 75% of the funds were given to colleges based on their enrollment of full-time equivalent Pell students, and then the remaining 25% was based on the FTE enrollment of non-Pell students. But it was quickly realized that this formula put community colleges at a pretty big disadvantage. CCs tend to enroll much larger percentages of part-time students, as well as enroll some more exclusively distance learners that weren't initially accounted for under CARES. So because of this, the later rounds of funding under the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, or the CRRSAA, as well as the American Rescue Plan, or ARP, adjusted their allocation formulas to include total headcount enrollment, so regardless of intensity, as well as FTE. So full-time students were still weighted much more heavily, but part-time students were now weighted more heavily in the allocation formula than they were under CARES. Additionally, distance learners were also now included in those later two acts. So part of our investigation here into these funds was showing that the allocation formula did work effectively. It was true that larger colleges with larger percentages of Pell and full-time students did tend to receive more money. So we've seen these big differences in the allocations, but now we wanted to explore any differences in spending patterns across colleges. So as we've said, most colleges in all states have spent most of their funds. This is another screen grab of the Tableau dashboard. I think currently the colors are going to show up a little bit differently when you go and explore yourself. But here, so the dark blue on this map shows states whose colleges spent at or near 100% of their funds, which you can see is a lot of them, while lighter colors are smaller percentages spent. So you can see many of these states have spent most, if not all, of their funds. And it's important to note that even those lighter blue colleges have spent the majority. Out of the total of 976 colleges here that we analyze, only about 7 or so spent less than 50% of their funds. And those 7 are not clustered in a single state. So states like Alabama that show up on this map as being a much kind of lower relative spender have still spent 80% of their funds. So this money is getting out the door. So while we can't say specifically why some of these colleges did spend smaller amounts of funds than others, we did want to take a look at some of the characteristics of these lower spending colleges relative to their counterparts who spent all or most of their funds, just to see if there are any differences that stand out. So to do this, we split colleges into 3 different bins: total spenders, higher spenders, and lower spenders. So the total spenders are the 484 colleges that spent more than 99.5% of their funds, which is actually the median amount of funds spent. 400 of these colleges, as Holly noted, did actually spend 100% of their funds, but we're classifying the other 84 as total spenders as well, as we're saying they kind of essentially spent all of their funds too. So higher spenders are colleges that spent between this median spending cutoff of 99.5% and 84.3% of their funds, which is the cutoff for the bottom decile of spending. And then lower spenders are colleges that fall into that bottom decile. These 98 colleges in the lower spenders, so while they're a much smaller group than either the total or higher, they do account for almost half of all unspent funds across these community colleges. So when we were comparing these colleges, we found that the higher and the total spenders looked pretty similar across a lot of the categories. So we really focused in our comparison on lower versus total spenders. In our report, however, there's a really big table in the appendix that has all of these characteristics and many, many more for each of these 3 spending groups. So if you're interested in these institutional and student characteristics that may differ or be similar across these different groups, I definitely encourage you to go take a look both at the section of the report that talks about these differences, but also at that appendix table for some more detail. So you can see that in a lot of ways, these 98 colleges that make up these lower spenders do look relatively similar to the total spenders in terms of award amounts and enrollment sizes, even though lower spenders, by definition, have a much smaller average percentage of funds spent. So their average total awards are relatively similar. They're slightly bigger than their total spenders, but all in all, relatively similar. The average institutional and student awards are also somewhat similar. Total spenders got a little bit more, but everything here is within about 1.5 million of one another. And then their average enrollment sizes, which importantly is really what drove the award amounts through the allocation formula, are nearly identical for lower spenders and total spenders. So where the differences really arise are really through these other awards that Megan and Holly both mentioned. So with lower spenders averaging over $5 million more, or about 4 times as much as total spenders. So as a reminder, these other awards are given due to certain institutional characteristics. So for example, minority serving institutions, or MSIs, received other awards. So did HBCUs, TCCUs, as well as colleges that serve really large proportions of low-income students through the SIP, or the Strengthening Institutions Program funds that went into the other bucket. So we can see a lot of these other characteristics through different student body characteristics in those lower spenders. So for example, we see that lower spenders have a much higher average percentage of students on federal Pell Grants than total spenders do. We also see that 8 out of 10 of the HBCUs in our sample are also in the lower spending group, and there's not a single HBCU in the total spender. So not a single HBCU spent all of its money. And then TCCUs follow a pretty similar pattern. 10 out of 18 of them are lower spenders, only 3 are total spenders. And then we can also see this reflected in some of the racial composition of the student bodies. Again, that appendix table gets into a lot more detail, but for example, we see that the average percentage of white students in the total spending group is 60%, while in the lower spending group, it's 42%. So to reiterate, we can't say any of these differences are why colleges are spending less of their funds. We also aren't saying that colleges didn't spend money because they didn't need it. It very well may be that those colleges that didn't, that relatively underspent, maybe didn't have the resources to spend this unprecedented amount of money. It is important for future research, however, to look deeper into these colleges that did relatively underspend, just in order to ensure that in the future there's both equitable funding of community colleges, as well as there are equitable supports being put in place to help colleges get that money out the door. So now I'll pass it back to Holly for some final remarks, as well as to show y'all that Tableau dashboard demonstration.
Great, thank you, Tia. So we know that the COVID-19 pandemic prompted Congress to act with urgency to support the US economy, which led to an unprecedented amount of CARE funds flowing into higher education institutions and community colleges in particular. There were also pretty modest initial guidelines on how these funds should be spent, yet the money was mostly spent. In general, institutions quickly and adeptly distributed funds to students and spent their remaining institutional and other funds to continue meeting the needs of both students and the institution. However, as Tia mentioned, adjustments to the allocation formulas were necessary to better account for part-time students and fully online students, and as the overwhelming majority of colleges spent most of their funds. So in future instances of federal emergency aid funding, or any college funding for that matter, equity in both the allocation and distribution processes should be considered at the onset, as should initial guidance in spending, particularly for that group of lower spenders. Over time, colleges undoubtedly came to rely on HERE funds amid decreasing funding at the state level and declining enrollments during the pandemic. So enrollments at community colleges were kind of declining before the pandemic, and we know they were exacerbated by the pandemic. And we've seen some recovery among enrollments, very modest recovery, but those gains are uneven. So generally, many students who stopped enrolling during the pandemic have not re-enrolled, leaving a portion of the population with some college but no credential. Further, the racial, ethnic, and economic disparities that were exacerbated by the pandemic have long-term implications for colleges. This leads us to question how colleges and students can continue to be supported moving forward, given some of the trends that we're seeing. And finally, we acknowledge that there may be questions that remain about the use of pandemic recovery funds that our descriptive analysis of funding and spending patterns can't answer. So there is a forthcoming institutional survey report by ARC Network researchers that seeks to address such questions. So the survey was distributed to community colleges in 6 states and asked colleges about decisions related to administering emergency aid to students, and distributing that institutional aid, their perceived efficacy of HERE dollars, and concerns about the end of HERE funding. The results from this analysis will be released in the spring of 2024, so stay tuned for that. We've talked a little bit about our Tableau dashboard, and if you're interested in learning more about this topic or exploring the data for yourself, in October of 2023, we released this dashboard on the ARC Network website using the data that we included in the report. The dashboard is linked here, and we will share these slides with you all so that you have links to everything. The dashboard allows users to explore award and spending trends at the national, state, regional, and institutional levels. So I do just want to do a quick demonstration. Today, I will focus on the national overview and institutional exploration pages, but we do also have a page that covers the background of HERE funds for those who may not be familiar. And there's also a page with technical notes if you're interested in more about our sampling or some of the acronyms that we use in the dashboard. So these icons are how you navigate between the pages. So I'll click on this map for the national overview. And you'll recognize this map as one that we included earlier in our presentation. But again, this shows the amount of HERE funds awarded to each state, darker colors representing the more money received. If you click on this gray button here in the bottom left, this will show you the percent spent, which the colors are slightly different in the presentation, but it is the same data showing darker states that spent more of their funds. So for the purposes of today, I will show the amount awarded map. You can hover over states to view information about the state and community colleges, the number of community colleges that they have, their enrollment in fall of 2020, the average HERE funds awarded per college, the total awarded at the state level, and again, the percent of HERE funds that were spent. And so we have filters on the left that you can use to click on a specific state. So for our sake, we can look at Alabama, which we know was one of our lower spenders. So when we click apply, you'll see that the map changes just to focus in on Alabama, and we can zoom in some. On the left, these amounts change. So total student, institutional, and other aid changes. We see that of the other aid that was received, colleges in Alabama, community colleges in Alabama only spent 61%. They spent 81% of their institutional aid, which is progress. But what we're excited to see is that they spent 100% of their student aid, which is exactly what we expect and hope to see. So that was encouraging. But these lower amounts of institutional and other aid that were spent really is what's contributing to their lower total aid of 80% being spent. Alternatively, you can look at states in a specific region or a specific locale or urbanicity. You can filter by those categories. So I'll click this button here to clear out the Alabama filter. And let's say we want to look at rural colleges in the Southeast. So if we click on region and we only select Southeast, then we can also filter by rural. And again, the map will change as you use these filters. The map changes, these numbers change as well. And what we can see is that 95% of rural colleges in the Southeast, rural colleges in the Southeast spent 95% of their total funds. So Mississippi and North Carolina and perhaps Virginia seem to be ones that received more funding. So though Florida does enroll a large number of community college students and have a large number of community colleges, we can see that only 5 of their community colleges are considered rural, versus North Carolina has 22 that are considered rural. That's pretty interesting. So you can stack these filters. You can manipulate the map and the filters in a number of different ways. So I'm going to clear out these filters before we move to the next page. Great. So we'll go to up here. Again, these are the icons. If you hover, you can see which page you're navigating to. So we'll go to the institutional exploration page. And on this page, you'll see these various dots that are differing in size. So each dot represents a college or a district in our sample. And the larger the dot, the more money the institution received. So similar to the national overview page, you can hover over a college and see some information. So this is, for example, Dallas College. They're located in Dallas, Texas. they enroll a large number of students, and they also receive a large number of HERE funds. They spent 95% of their funds, and they did receive aid, some other aid for being a minority serving institution, and they also received some supplemental aid as well. So again, similar to the national overview page, you can filter in this map if we want to look at only colleges in the state of Florida. For example, we can filter by my home state of Florida. And then we'll zoom in just so we can see these a little bit better. You'll see that the number of institutions here in the corner will update. And so this includes both technical colleges and our traditional community colleges in Florida. Down at the bottom, we have those IPEDS variables that we mentioned earlier that we pulled in. So you can actually hover over these bars to see what the color represents and what amount it consists of. So here, of the community college students in Florida, we see that 59% of those were not eligible for Pell Grants, and the remaining 41% were. So we can click on a specific college. Let's look at Miami-Dade, which happens to be the biggest circle here. And when we click on Miami-Dade College, again, we see that those bars update to represent the large Hispanic population that Miami-Dade serves. If we look on the left, these numbers have also updated. It's a great thing to see that they spent 100% of their student aid, 86% of their institutional, and 60% of their other. This is a very large amount of other aid, as you can see. So it may not be surprising that it wasn't all spent. This is more aid than some colleges received in total. So they also received a supplemental amount of aid, which could have come, at a later point. Institutions didn't necessarily receive all of their other aid at the same time. So that could have played into why 60% of that was spent. And one note regarding the designation as MSI or TCCU or HBCU, these were taken from the U.S. Department of Education. So if an institution received funding, other funding for MSI, HBCU, or TCCU, we flagged those accordingly in our data set. And you can filter by that institutional designation on the left. If you perhaps only want to look at MSIs, you can absolutely do that. So with that in mind, we encourage you to spend some time on the dashboard, and we would be happy to hear any insights that you gather or exciting findings that you come across. So we do have a few questions to leave you with as you consider our findings and think about what's next in terms of community college funding. We encourage you to explore the Tableau dashboard on your own to look for patterns or disparities in your state or among specific community colleges, and to consider what implications our findings or your own findings from the dashboard may have for equitable access to resources. Finally, we also encourage you to think about how these findings can be leveraged to strategically allocate resources and tailor support initiatives in the absence of federal pandemic recovery funds moving forward. We also want to share some of the new products from the ARC network on this topic. So the blog post on the left is currently published and is linked here. The same authors recently released a brief this week, actually, that discusses the importance of HERE funding for colleges and how colleges will have to navigate the new fiscal realities that we're in after the pandemic. So I also encourage you to join the CCRC mailing list, which I believe we'll share a link to in the chat. You can also join the mailing list at the bottom of the CCRC or ARC network website to stay up to date on our latest publications and events. So I do want to thank you all for your time and attention. We have a report linked here, which you can access from the QR code as well. Tia, Megan, and I are happy to continue our conversation via email if you would like. We're also happy to answer any questions that you may have now. So feel free to drop your questions in the chat if you have any.
Thanks, Holly. And also thank you to Tia and Megan. I really enjoyed your presentation. I just wanted to say I particularly enjoyed the walkthrough of Tableau. I think it really, demonstrated the powerfulness of the dashboard. So I appreciated the time and effort you took to walk us through that. As Holly mentioned, please do drop any questions you have in the chat so that we can have our panelists, presenters, answer them now. You're also always welcome to email them separately. But while we wait for some questions to come in, I noted that during the presentation that you all mentioned that colleges received limited guidance on how to spend TIER funds. And I was just wondering what instructions or advice did colleges receive, if any? And like, were there limitations on what they could do with the funds or any other sorts of kind of directives they received from the government?
Yeah, I can take that one. So there was guidance from the CARES Act directly, like the legislation, and the U.S. Department of Education did provide a great deal of autonomy in spending these funds. But the initial guidance made it clear that the student aid was to go directly to students in the form of those emergency financial aid grants, and colleges were urged to use some or all of those institutional funds for more student aid. So the Department of Education was like very diligent about updating their website. They did release FAQs and supplemental FAQs to clarify questions from the colleges, and also to provide additional guidance. And from what we could see from our own learning about this funding and the questions that we had, it seems that these documents were updated pretty regularly. So we do commend the Office of Post-Secondary Education for their work to provide clear and timely information, especially as I'm sure they were just inundated with questions. But a lot of that initial guidance was directly from the CARES Act and just from some announcements from the U.S. Department of Education, from what we could tell.
Thanks. So we do have a question from the audience. Courtney Francis asked if you could speak a little bit more to the implications of HBCUs not using all of their CARE funds.
Yeah, and Tia, feel free to tag team this with me. This is one that kind of, made us scratch our heads and consider why such a large number of HBCUs didn't spend their funds. We wondered if there were factors that we just couldn't know from a descriptive analysis, perhaps around institutional capacity, that might have prevented HBCUs from distributing the funds. It could be, struggles that they had with technology, or a number of different possibilities that we kind of racked our brain about. But as I mentioned, we do have that institutional survey that's going out to colleges that could maybe help us better understand some of the challenges that colleges faced. But there definitely are implications. And we're hopeful that further research can dig into this and perhaps look at the lower spenders and what it means that they didn't spend all of their funding by the deadline. It could be that these colleges also requested extensions. So I said that June 30th deadline was, the initial deadline that was set. Maybe they simply needed a little bit more time. They did get additional funding for being an HBCU, or in our case, just a historically Black college. So maybe they needed some more time for that, and perhaps they could have requested those extensions. But that's definitely one that that we thought a lot about. Tia, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, I mean, I think that you hit all the points super well. Yeah, just one data point piece to add is when we were looking at these funds, we also kind of looked at the amount of funds each college received, scaled by their enrollment size, which is what we called per student. So like funds per student, and HBCUs did on average receive way more money per student than other colleges did, and that was at least what we supposed to be, just through what we knew about the allocation formula and how the funds worked, is that was really because they got so much money through these other funds. And so they did, relative to their sizes, they did have a lot more money to work with. So I think that just kind of loops right back into what Holly was saying, is we can't say why. I think that the main implication of that finding is that's just such a great avenue for further investigation. And seeing if, was this also happening on potentially the 4-year side of things as well with HBCUs. Yeah, just seeing kind of what that mechanism was. Perhaps they're still spending the money, as Holly mentioned about the extensions. Perhaps it was related, to capacity constraints in terms of getting the money out to people. We can't really say. It's a really important avenue for future research for sure.
Thank you. And thanks, Courtney, for the question. So again, really encouraging people to drop questions if they have any. And as we wait, I was also wondering if the team had any findings that they wanted to highlight that were particularly interesting or surprising as you went through these analyses.
Yeah, I can take that. To us, the most surprising finding was that by and large, colleges actually spent all of their money, despite the unprecedented amount of funds awarded to them. Colleges were particularly adept at spending the student funds in particular, in the form of cash grants, and we were really pleasantly surprised that like 878 or like 90% of our colleges in our sample were considered either total or high spenders, which like really spent all or almost all of their funds. So that was a really pleasant and surprising finding.
Thanks, Megan. We also had a follow-up question about the survey work that we keep kind of previewing. So Courtney mentioned that we've seen huge benefit of these funds for students who attended community colleges. Do you feel this survey will support your research team in understanding more specifically in how the funds were used or distributed?
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. Yes, exactly. It definitely will. So the purposes of the survey are really to get an idea of, on the student side of things, how colleges decided to disperse their funds to students in terms of determining eligibility and determining how much money went to each student, how they physically tried to get that money out to the students. Was it automatically put in their account? Was it a different mechanism? And then how successful the colleges perceived that to be. And then on the institutional side, we're really getting at, what type of institutional expenditures did your college spend this money on? How much money did you put towards these different kinds of expenditures? How did those things change over time throughout the pandemic? And how did those kind of priorities shift? As well as, again, those perceived successes. And then there are other aspects to it as well in terms of, challenges that colleges reported having in spending these funds, as well as the concerns they have with the end of the funds moving forward, and kind of these unmet needs. And then also kind of these changes in student supports, like relative to the student supports that colleges may have had in place before. How did this money kind of prop up potentially some of those avenues in supporting students moving forward after the pandemic? So yes, so that is the long answer to a yes. The survey will definitely be getting at a lot of these different avenues for how was it used, how was it distributed, and perceived successes.
Thanks, Tia. Don't think that we're getting many more. Oh, just as I was speaking. Marcia Butland, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, mentions that once had a question about who's receiving the survey at the institutions. So I know that this effort has already been underway, but maybe Tia, you can speak a little bit to the sampling and strategy, and who answered on behalf of the institutions, and maybe even explain a little bit more about the states that were surveyed.
Yeah, totally. So we surveyed, well, we partnered with the Public Policy Institute of California, PPIC in California, who um, did the survey in California, and then we at CCRC did the survey in 5 different states. We did it in Michigan, Ohio, New York, Tennessee, and Texas. And we had state level partners in each of those states that helped us identify primary contacts at each of the community colleges in those states. And we instructed colleges for one person to fill out the survey, but often it was a team effort of different departments coming together to answer different questions. And so, yeah, we ended up getting a sample of 100, including California's efforts, of about 170 colleges that we're analyzing, and those results will be out soon.
New York was in, I'm not sure if we know offhand specific institutions, but the survey went out last summer. So we've been processing those data for the last 6 months or so. So will there be opportunities for collaboration on research? Andrea, Thurston mentions that they would love to compare data from the education trusts found in Texas with the results you all found.
Yeah, I mean, feel free to reach out to us. We haven't had the opportunity to collaborate with anyone or share, our data with folks outside of CCRC or the ARC network. So I'd definitely be interested to learn more about what the Education Trust has found and how that compares with our data. So it'd be great to hear from you.
Yeah, and I would just mention that this team, we call them the expenditures team, but is part of a larger ARC network, which the team kind of briefly mentioned. So IES funded a series of research projects across the country, and we are, collaborating to an extent. And, just this morning, we've been thinking about other ways to kind of get other researchers involved through webinars and other means. So if you are interested, just please let us know. You can email Holly specifically about the expenditure analysis, but you're also welcome to just get in contact with us through the ARC Network website, and we can get you on the newsletter or anything else.
Okay, awesome. Well, if there aren't any more questions, again, just thank you everyone for being here today, and thank you for the questions. I look forward to continuing the conversation. So have a great one, everyone. Thanks again.